During an election year, the news always talks about candidates. Well, today we're going to talk about you. How does your faith inform your actions during an election year? Hi, I'm Stuart Shepard, and this is First Liberty Live. Thank you for liking and sharing these episodes. That's how we get to meet new people, and it's an important part of this whole process. So I just want to say thank you from all of us for caring enough about these conversations to share them with your friends. Dr. Albert Mohler is president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Did I pronounce it right? Did I say Louisville correctly?
You said it good. Well, that's right. That works.
I grew up just down the road, just down I-64 from you there. Hi, Al. Good to have you.
Anything but Louisville.
Oh, yeah, we cannot do that. Yeah. Hey, I want to talk to you today about elections and our role in that and how we should think about it as people of faith. One of the gifts that America's founders gave to us is something called the free exercise of religion. It's that guarantee. Yeah. They put it right in the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. They put it above the law and the courts. They put it out of reach of politicians and activists. Help us understand how those four simple words have helped shape this country.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, Stuart. You know, in the Bill of Rights, when you look at the First Amendment, it has two clauses related to religion. And not my favorite word, but that's exactly the right word for this occasion.
Yeah.
And the first is that the government may not establish any state religion. But the second is that every citizen has the right to free religious expression, the free expression of our faith. And that means, by the way, that we can form congregations. It means that we can form denominations. We can send missionaries. We can evangelize. We can bear public witness. And the most important thing is that the Constitution is read by too many people, particularly on the cultural left, as to saying what citizens can't do. Actually, it doesn't make any reference to what citizens can't do. It says the government can't establish a religion, but it comes right back and says citizens are free fully to exercise our religious convictions.
In your book that you wrote a few years ago, We Cannot Be Silent, you opened by describing a childhood memory of yours. You're standing next to your grandfather. You're looking out at a landscape that's been devastated by a hurricane. Things are flattened, trees are torn down, roofs are gone. Right. And you compare that to the rapid change in the moral landscape in America, how quickly that can happen. You spend all of chapter 8 in the book talking about religious liberty and the urgent challenge to religious liberty that we're seeing in the culture. That book came out in 2015. How are things looking in 2024?
I think the hurricane's even bigger. When we wake up these days and look at the landscape, it's changed even more remarkably. So when I wrote that book, same-sex marriage was not yet what was mandated by the Supreme Court as legal from coast to coast. And by the way, when I wrote that book, the T in LGBTQ was so quiet, it was virtually not a part of the cultural conversation. That was true. Up front, and it's one of the front lines of religious liberty. So that's how fast this is moving. You know, as a theologian and observer of the culture, one of the things I'm very aware of is what the sociologists call cultural velocity. It's the velocity of change. And so a part of what makes the Middle Ages is that cultural change was incredibly slow. Yeah. Even in the 20th century, where things sped up, it still took a long, long time for the civil rights movement to work its way through the society. You look at the LGBTQ movement, it has been like lightning speed. And so I think it's really important for Christians to understand that this velocity is something that's very, very unsettling. And and by the way, this also means that the younger people are, the more they just think it's always been this way.
True.
And so, if you have someone who has really come into thinking about these things after 2015, they just think, well, same-sex marriage is a part of the law of the land. Well, it wasn't a day before that decision was handed down.
We have legal cases we're engaged in right now here at First Liberty Institute that involve people who were fired or forced out of their jobs because of their faith. They're real people. I've sat in their living rooms. I've talked to them. I've heard their stories. A few examples. One's a nurse practitioner fired by CVS Minute Clinic because her faith led her to an unequivocal pro-life position. Another fired from her job as a physician's assistant because she could not in good conscience affirm the orthodoxy on transgenderism that you were just referring to there. We represented a college professor who was fired because he taught the scientific facts about what makes us male and female in an anatomy and physiology class, and he got canned over it. We got his job back, and he's back in the classroom now. It strikes me that practically all of the cultural battles in America center on, one way or another, our ability to live out our faith. Right. What does a proper relationship between this wayward culture and religious liberty look like? How would that work?
Well, I think from the Christian's perspective, it has to work where we understand our responsibility as salt and light, as a disciple of the Lord Jesus Christ, and together as Christians in congregations, and given even movements of Christians that we would start, driven by Christian biblical conviction. We don't stop at the line between the church and the culture, just say we can't go out in the culture and bear public witness. No, we understand we're called to do precisely that. Now, you raise a host of issues because I think it's becoming increasingly difficult for Christians in many professions and many professional contexts. I am particularly concerned for young Christians on college and university campuses because there is so much social pressure being put on them, and in many cases by administrators and cultural forces that, quite frankly, are violating the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution with their kind of requirements that they're putting in place. And I think the LGBTQ plus movement and others are pushing so hard, it's going to be increasingly difficult for Christians to be in certain professions and in certain areas of work. That's why we need you and other religious liberty organizations, very clearly defending Christian rights in this sense. But I think we just have to understand that societies work on the basis of some kind of settled morality. And what the left is working on as hard as it possibly can is to settle an entire new morality where previous morality had once been established. And, Christians need to understand what we're up against. It's not just a bunch of isolated battlefronts. It's a giant, giant struggle.
Let's talk about the election. For most of us, the way that we can most directly speak into the culture that we're talking about is through our vote and through the choices that we make at the ballot box. It seems there are a lot of people this time around who are just unenthused about this election. We've seen, and I know you've seen the statistics over the years, that a lot of people of faith, church-going people, don't show up at the polls. They just stay home, sit it out, aren't even registered to vote. How would you give them a nudge to do the right thing? What would you say?
Well, I would simply ask the question, how are you going to speak to your grandchildren in time to come, saying that when these great issues are being hammered out and argued in the culture, you didn't even think it was important enough to vote? By the way, it's not uncomplicated. Let's just admit that. It's not uncomplicated. It would be wonderful if we were in a situation in which we had perfect candidates or even candidates that fit a kind of a standard profile in terms of American presidential history. I just want to be honest, in 2024, that game's over.
Yeah.
We're in a different terrain, and it's more challenging for Christians. But I'll tell you what, by the time folks are paying attention to what you and I are conversing about here, look at how many issues are going to be abundantly clear on the battle for life, on the battle for any kind of restraint on the sexual passions of a society, the battle over religious liberty. All these things they are increasingly tied to the differences between two parties, not just to the differences between, say, two nominees. And so that's one of the things I say to Christians. Number one, you're going to give an answer for the stewardship that you were given on the vote. So not voting is a vote. You are just empowering other voters to make the decision. And I don't think that's a valid Christian option. The next thing is we need to understand that the lines in our society these days are increasingly reduced to a partisan set of choices. There used to be, old George Wallace used to say in the 60s, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. Well, there's a lot more than a dime's worth of difference right now. We're down to fundamental issues. So I'm not about to say that the candidate doesn't matter. That would be Christian idiocy. But I am saying we have to understand that regardless of the two candidates, we've got two great big arguments out there in the public square represented by these two parties, and it does make a difference.
I remember a conversation I had with a friend who heads up the Family Policy Council in Connecticut, and we were talking about elections, and he was explaining to me. He said, we never have a true conservative, Christian conservative candidate on the ballot.
Right.
So they have to make choices, and they're hard choices, but that's what we're called to do. We have to pick out which one is at least friendly toward my values, which one at least is going to move things in the general direction of my values, even if they disagree with some of the fundamental things that I believe in. You still have to make choices. What do you think about that assessment? Would you agree?
Yeah, no, I absolutely. And I've been at this for a very, very long time. And all I want to say is that the issues are getting more complicated, but it still comes down to the fact when you go to the ballot's not much more complicated. And so, yeah, the issues, we're talking about fundamental issues here.
Yeah.
I didn't vote in the 1960 election, let me hasten to say. I was a baby at the time. But in the 1960 election, there was no basic disagreement between the two parties on any big moral issue. There was just none. There was a moral consensus in this country. By 8 years later, that's beginning to break apart, 1968. You come to the present, we're talking about issues of massive consequence that are being decided and debated in our society. And it's pretty much predictable. So, all I want to say, Stuart, is no one said this was going to be easy. But as you were just talking about the situation with that person in Connecticut, there's a situation now in which we could say, well, we're all kind of living in Connecticut. But it's not just the candidates. It's also the entire argument of two opposing political parties. And so, one of the interesting things, I'm going to speak perhaps more candidly here than you expect, but, the big problem in the Democratic Party is not only the nominee, but it's the fact that he's kind of out of step with the left wing of his own party. And so, in other words, regardless of who's the nominee, the Democratic Party, on the issues of the LGBTQ revolution, on the issue of abortion, you just go down the list. If it isn't this candidate, it's going to be someone to his left. And, on the other side, I'm just concerned that Republicans have had a very clear message on so many of these things, including abortion. And I would just warn the leaders of the Republican Party about sending an ambivalent or confusing signal on these issues. I think by the time we get to November, Stuart, I think Christian voters are going to have a real clear picture of what's at stake.
I know I'm a big fan of your podcast, The Briefing. Listen to it most every day. It's the same length as my drive to work, so it fits perfectly in there. My son is also a fan. So I know every Friday on your podcast, you take questions from listeners and you answer those. So I thought I'd do that with you here. So I've got a couple of questions. One's for my son. He's a 19-year-old, just finished up his freshman year of college studying aviation business management.
That's great.
He's a regular listener, as I mentioned. We know, so I texted him this morning. I asked him, I'm going to talk to Al. Do you have any questions for him? And this is what he sent back. He said, where do you see cultural secularization headed in the next 15 years? What's down the road?
Wow. What's his first name?
Andrew.
Andrew. No, I appreciate the question a very great deal. Let me just say that I think what is going to happen is that there's going to be a far more aggressive secularism that replaces the kind of secularism we know right now. And I'll tell you where that shows up. There are entire sectors of society right now where, quite frankly, no one even knows what we're talking about when we talk about, say, historic biblical Christianity. And so, it's hard to put this into words, but we're kind of in a situation where the good old days were when the liberals knew what they were rejecting and the secularists knew what they were opposing.
Yeah.
We're in a situation now where I'm called by young reporters for major, media outlets and, the brand names of the big newspapers. And quite frankly, they don't have a clue what I'm going to say. Huh. In other words, they're so distant from Christianity. And you know what? They're the products of an increasingly aggressive secularization and even an ideological secularism. So I appreciate Andrew's question very much. I just want to say, I think it's going to be more aggressive as time passes. And I'll tell you where to watch this. Where to watch this is on the front line of the LGBTQ plus revolution. Because what you see right now is the LGBT movement saying, we need to go after these religious exemptions from like Christian colleges when it comes to Title IX definitions. You see the Biden administration's recent moves, just tightening that noose. And I think they will be coming aggressively at the rights of Christian people in the say in small business owners to say you're not going to be able to do business. I have seen this already in some parts of the country, especially on the two coasts, where you have major business cultures that are simply saying we're not going to. These are big businesses saying we're just going to agree we're not going to do business with people who don't affirmatively sign on to a certain kind of pretty radical moral statement, and what they package is non-discrimination. Well, the next thing you know, you don't have any clients. Your roofing company doesn't have any business. And so there are people who say, the front edge of this is going to be in people like, who are medical doctors. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And lawyers with the American Bar Association. Yes, it is. But you know what? It's going to show up for the roofers and the mechanics as well. And so I think that's going to be the change in the next 15 years. I think the secular culture is just going to get more and more aggressive.
One of my coworkers, Megan, is about to have a baby boy in September. We're very excited for her. She's been thinking a lot about the future, given that event coming up. So she has this question for you. How can we safeguard religious freedom for our children and grandchildren? What can we do now to protect them in the future?
I simply want to say that as not only a father, but now the grandfather of three, it just incredibly changes your perspective. And so I think of those three precious grandchildren all the time. And I think, what is the world they're going to inherit?
Yeah.
And then I ask myself the question, what is my stewardship to do as much as possible to defend their liberties, their religious liberty in particular, the place of, their Christian convictions in years to come. And I think one of the most important things we can do is just make certain that we are setting as many precedents as possible, that frankly, we are seating as many judges as possible, that we are training as many young litigators as possible, that we are training and educating and preparing not only law students, but those who will be law professors in order to press back on these arguments. Here's one of the great, very encouraging lessons of the last half century. We would not be talking about the Supreme Court of the United States in terms that we talk about it now. And by the way, that means the left wouldn't be talking about it in the terms of antipathy that it talks about it now. Had there not been a revolution with people encouraging young people to go into the law and to understand the deeper issues than what they would confront even in their law school, in terms of even how to read the Constitution, how to read the law, that did bring about a revolution. And that revolution didn't stop a lot of the nonsense. But you know what? It at least for a period of time, has put an enormous brake. I mean, the work of First Liberty, the work of my own institution would be very different had that argument not emerged when it did and turned into a movement that changed the federal judiciary. And it's a sign of hope to us. In other words, we've just got to out-argue the other side, and we've got to do as much as possible to use our stewardship to perpetuate a rightful constitutional understanding of religious liberty. And, for that sweet little boy, and I congratulate you and pray God's blessings on you in advance. We need to do everything we can to make certain that the world he inherits from us and this nation, this national experiment he inherits from us, protects the very liberties upon which the Republic was established. And by the way, if not, we're going to have to pray that the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ will do everything possible to pour faith and conviction into his life so that he will be faithful, even if the society is not.
I just want to express my appreciation and admiration for you. You've been a clear, consistent voice for what is true in a culture that often doesn't want to hear it. You've not shied away from things. You've spoken boldly when it needs to be said, but yeah, you've done it with grace, compassion, and wisdom, and I just so appreciate the way that you go about it. I want to recommend to people, we talked about the briefing earlier, let people know where they can find it, how can they listen to it, how often does it come out, all those things.
The briefing is 5 days a week. Early in the morning, it's released. It's about a 25-minute summary of Christian engagement with the big issues, the big worldview issues of the day. And I appreciate you asking. It's found at albertmohler.com, and it's along with the other program, Thinking in Public, which is an in-depth program with the people who are shaping society. Both of them are found on all the major podcast platforms, The Briefing and Thinking in Public. And you can also just go to the website at Albert Mohler, that's Mohler.com. And Stuart, I really appreciate that. And I'm glad to be with you in this battle and with the friends at First Liberty.
Very good. Before I let you go, anything else you want to share?
I just want to say, and I appreciated your very kind comments. I just want to say, look, the world wants to rob us of our joy. And as Christians, look, we have to understand the scale of the issues we're up against. Matters of life and death when it comes to abortion and euthanasia and so many other issues. Matters of grave consequence. But in Christ, we are also to engage our neighbors, not only with conviction, but with joy and Christian witness. So I just pray that we will do that together until Jesus comes.
Dr. Albert Mohler, thank you so much for your time. It's always a joy and a pleasure to get to talk to you.
Stuart, God bless you. Great to be with you.
You too. If you want to see America's religious heritage defended, would you consider supporting the work of us here at First Liberty Institute? That's what we do all day, every day, for people all over the country. And our clients never, ever get a bill from us, ever, because of the generous support of people just like you. Just look for the big red Give button up at the top of the page. First Liberty is fighting for what matters most.